In this bonus video on pronouns, I would like to look at the work of Emile Benveniste, the French linguist who had some very interesting things to say in his chapter on pronouns in the work Problem in General Linguistics. And this book is from 1966. So Benveniste makes a distinction between two kinds of pronouns. The first have to do with syntax, and the second have to do with what he calls the instance of discourse. The instance of discourse. And another word for this is the speech situation. So by syntax, he means that language consists of many signs, right? Words that refer to something that they signify. And syntax means really the rules for combining these signs. How do we combine them? What is the proper order? And how do they relate to each other? Many pronouns fit within this syntax perfectly well. There's nothing unusual about them. But what Benveniste is interested in really is more this second type of pronoun, where we're talking about a speech situation and where we have two pronouns in particular that are kind of unusual and that really need our attention. So what are these two pronouns? Well, they are I, the first person, and you, the second person. These are the ones that Benveniste really focuses on, and he tries to indicate what makes them kind of unique. So if we think about I and you then, one of the difficulties is how do we define them? If we take a regular noun by contrast, like the word car, let's say, we can easily form some kind of mental image of what that noun looks like. Maybe our image is going to be a little bit different for all of us, right? Let's draw kind of a funny looking car here, but there's probably going to be quite a bit of similarity. And this image is the potential, the objective kind of potential that may become actual in our language. Whereas in the case of I, what is I? It may be me in this case. So my name is Conrad. There we go. But I could also be Sarah, if that's your name. I could be Bob. And you can imagine this list goes on and on and on. I doesn't really have the same field of reference. It doesn't work in the same way as a signifier. So how do we define it then? Well, Benveniste comes up with a definition that's actually quite funny. He says, I is the individual who utters the present instant of discourse containing the linguistic instance I, which is really a mouthful. And what he's essentially saying here is that I is the person who is saying I. As you can probably tell, that's a kind of circular definition, right? We could say that this is a type of tautology, where you define something without really offering much new information. You're going in circles. We could say the same thing about you. So I'll simplify here, but essentially we could define you as you is the person spoken to as you. Does that help? I'm not entirely sure. So what Benveniste concludes about this then is that both of these pronouns, I and you, can be considered empty signs. You could put a question mark inside them. They're almost like containers, and they lack reference, so we can call them non-referential, right? They don't refer to something specifically. Instead, they are filled during speech. They are filled when we are speaking. And then that can change depending on who uses the pronoun I. That person is I, or you in this case. So filled during speech. And I think this is kind of an interesting point, that these pronouns are so unique, that there's something in language that's very much dependent on speech, on a particular situation. Now, we can then also tie this in with another word from the world of linguistics that applies here, and this is the word deixis. So deixis, which is a fancy way to talk about pointing, when you point to something or things around you. So if we think of a person here, right, a person, then this person can be talking to other people. Let's use a different color for this. So this could be you, could be somebody else as well. That could be he or she. And the I, in this case, let's be consistent here, the I is in a very unique position. Other words that apply to the I are words like now and here, right? These things all apply. As a result, there are actually different types of deixis, different types of pointing. One of these has to do with time. So if we think, for instance, of, we'll draw a timeline here. If we think of time, we could say, well, this is the future here, so later this or that thing will happen, or tomorrow I will do this, right? We could also say earlier or yesterday in relation to the now moment. Notice that this is different, though, from saying something like the day before, let's say, the day before. We don't have to measure the day before from our now moment. This could be measured from any point in history, anything that happened. And so the day before as an expression is a little bit different from these examples of deixis. As mentioned, there are other types of deixis as well, so we can also talk about space. Right, so let's just increase this a little bit here. We can talk about space. We've already mentioned here, but we can also talk about there, let's say. We can talk about this and that. So if we're talking about things close to us, we might say this thing. We are pointing to this particular thing. As mentioned, we have you, he, and she here. These are all examples of deixis of person. And then there's one more we could mention here, and this has to do with tense. So pretty much every verb is measured in relation to the now moment. If we say, for instance, let's use an example here. If we say, I sped, I was speeding in my car, then the verb sped is in the past tense. And so the tense of the verb is measured from the now moment, from the here and now. And we can do this with all the different tenses. What Benveniste points out then, and he certainly doesn't invent this notion of deixis necessarily, but what he points out is that if we think about the I and the you, it fits within this scheme, but we shouldn't just think of it as an example of deixis. There's something very unique about I and about you. We've seen already the trouble of defining these terms clearly, but we should also distinguish them from the third person, from things like he and she. Those kinds of references, they are less related to the speech situation, to the instance of discourse. They are more objective. And if we take an example, we can see this. So if we write, for instance, John has a bike. So here's an example. John has a bike. Right? This doesn't have much to do with deixis. We're not pointing to anything here. Then we can easily replace this also with these third-person pronouns. We can say he, and then we can say something about it. He often rides it. And we've replaced bike with it as well. So in this case, we have third-person pronouns. They're referring to something quite objective, and their meaning is not constantly changing with the speech situation. So hopefully that gives you a new and interesting perspective on both deixis and on what makes the first and second persons kind of unique.